Hello everybody and welcome back to our channel. We are Brigade of Beings, a diagnosed dissociative identity disorder system. My name is Cindy and today we're going to be discussing our thoughts about the show, The Crowded Room. So we have a lot of thoughts about this show. This is going to be our thoughts on the system representation within it. We're not going to go in depth discussing the plot. So it might not make sense if you haven't seen the show fully, because when we were trying to discuss the plot, when we were trying to discuss all of our thoughts, the video was looking to be at around 3 hours long, and we do not have the ability to film all of that. We do not have the ability to edit all of that. So we've shortened the video significantly. We're just going to be discussing 5 things that we liked about the show, 5 things that we disliked about the show, and then seeing if it meets the 3 points that we're reviewing on every single piece of DID media that we review. Was it accurate to the diagnosis? Did we enjoy the piece of media? And was it stigmatizing? Before we get into discussing the things that we liked and disliked about the show, I'm going to give a brief interview about the characters that we're going to be referencing regularly. So first, the characters who do not have DID. The first is Raya. She is the therapist that is assigned to the system throughout their court case to assess them, to work out what is going on, and to help them navigate the court case. The next is Candy. She is the system's biological mother. She is the one who raised them. And then the third is Marlon, who is the system's stepfather. And then we have the system themselves. We're going to assign our own role terms to these alters, but these terms are not used within the show specifically. So the first alter is Danny. He is the host of the system, and at the start of the show, he is completely unaware that he has DID. The next alter is Ariana, or Ari. She is a trauma holder and a protector, and is a very, very prominent alter within the system's life. The next alter we have is Yitzhak. He is a physical protector. He comes and goes semi-regularly and mainly only shows up when the system is in physical danger or perceives him to be in physical danger. The next 2 are Johnny and Mike. We've lumped them together because they often front together, at least they're portrayed to front together within the show. I would classify them as protectors and social alters, with Johnny also being an addiction holder and a trauma holder. Then there is Jack. Jack is the system's gatekeeper. He basically is able to control who is able to front. He's able to make alters go dormant, and he has a lot of power and influence within the system. And then the final alter, which is a plot twist that he's an alter, is Adam. Adam is a child's part. Danny believes Adam to be a separate being to himself. He believes Adam to be his brother. There's a reoccurring theme where Danny thinks the other alters are separate beings. We'll get into it. But Adam is believed by Danny to be his biological brother. Turns out he's another alter in the system. And Adam is one of the major trauma holders within the system. There are other alters as well who don't have names, but those are the ones who have names. There are other characters as well, but those are the prominent ones that we'll be referencing. So now that we know who is who, let's get into the first thing that we disliked about the show, and that is that the system is violent. So the show itself is supposedly based off of a book about Billy Milligan, who, if you don't know, is a serial killer who had dissociative identity disorder. And that in itself is already a bad start. And I don't think was necessary. The show itself stands alone outside of The Many Faces of Billy Milligan, which is the book. It didn't need to be linked to that book, and it just could have existed as its own piece of media, and we would have less reservations about it. But because it is related to this book, there is violence throughout this entire book, and specifically the system being violent and being a perpetrator of crimes. Although within the show itself, the system does not actually kill anybody. There is a lot of nuance between this system in particular being violent, and that nuance comes from the fact they are mostly violent in a either reactionary stance where someone else was violent towards them first, in a protective way where their fight response has been activated, and even though someone else wasn't actively violent towards them, they perceived a threat, or they are violent towards people who have perpetrated harm against them. And it is a nuanced topic because I don't necessarily think that the system was unnecessarily violent. Like, the violence throughout the entire show had a purpose. It was, like, you could see where it was coming from. That doesn't make it excusable, but you could see where it came from and you could see why they behaved in that way. But we disliked it because so many pieces of representation about DID are just about the system being violent, and that is not true to the majority of systems. And even when a system is violent, it's often in a reactionary or a defensive way. And even though, like I said, there are serial killers with dissociative identity disorder, there are many, many, many more people out there with DID who wouldn't even consider hurting someone, let alone act on those thoughts. I don't think we'd have as much of an issue with the violence in this show, even if it was portrayed the exact same way, if it wasn't linked to the Many Faces of Billy Milligan. Because realistically speaking, the violence within this show was human. Like, it was someone trying to protect themselves, and it wasn't okay. Like, you don't just go and shoot up a public space because someone has assaulted you in the past. That's not okay. But it was, like, you could see why it happened, and it wasn't just someone going around and killing other people. There was a very different intent behind it. And if the show had changed none of its plot, none of its structure, and just not said that it was inspired by the Faces of Billy Milligan, then it would be fine by us. There's still issues that we have, which we'll get into, but it would have made the show markedly improved, in our opinion. Now on to something that we liked. And something that we liked is that the legal defense for Danny and the system was not trying to get him off entirely. They were not trying to say, he's done nothing wrong, he should get a get out of jail free card. They were saying that this is an individual who is severely unwell. Prison time is not going to help him. It is going to actively make it worse. He needs to go to a psychiatric facility and receive treatment. And that is what ends up happening. They end up winning the case. And I think that it's good that they don't try to go, oh, he's done nothing wrong. Like, oh, he was just protecting himself, therefore he's done nothing wrong. He did do stuff wrong. He committed crimes. He needed to face repercussions for that. But again, there's so much to say about prison and how it screws people up and it sets people up for failure, and it's not actually a great way to reform people in general. But I'm not going to go into our political rants when talking about this show. But his defense team is right. He still needs to face consequences, but prison is not the correct option, and I like that they show that, and I like that they successfully get him into a psychiatric facility where he receives treatment, and at the end of the show seems to be doing better. And I think that it's really, really important to acknowledge that just because one alter does a crime and another alter is unaware of it, because there were alters in the system who were unaware of the crime that was being committed, it doesn't mean that the system gets off scot-free. It's not saying that, oh, Astral committed a crime, but I, Cindy, shouldn't go to jail. No, the body physically committed a crime. We should face consequences for it. And I like that that is acknowledged in the show, that the system needs to face accountability for their actions. It's not said in as many words. It's kind of messy. There is, like, the people that they're fighting against in court, the other lawyers are like, so you're saying that they shouldn't have any repercussions because somebody else did it? And they're like, no, that's not what we're saying. We're saying that this individual is severely unwell and needs help, and prison is not going to be helpful. The second thing we disliked about the show is that the dissociative identity disorder is used as a plot twist. I will say that within the show they're referring to it as multiple personality disorder. That makes sense. It's set in, is it the 70s or the 80s? Anyway, it's set before multiple personality disorder was formally in the DSM-5, and the disorder was renamed to DID in the 90s. So I don't have a problem with them calling it multiple personality disorder. I do wish there was kind of like a disclosure, like in the credits or something, that this disorder has now been renamed. But within the show, within the actual like plot of it, it makes sense that they're calling it multiple personality disorder. I don't have an issue with that. I do have an issue with the fact they use DID as a plot twist. It's always used as a goddamn plot twist. It's always like, oh my god, there's something going wrong. What could it be? Oh my god, there's other people doing things. Like, every fucking time. Like, can we not just have a story where it's not the fucking plot twist? And it was used as a plot twist at multiple times. Even when we knew that the system was a system, it was still, alters were used as plot twists. Like, the system perceived, at least Danny perceived, the other alters as being separate entities to him, which again, isn't really how DID functions, isn't really how it presents. It's very, very uncommon for systems, especially systems who are in their teens or in their adult years, to believe that the other alters in their system are physical other people. Like, Danny is at least portrayed within the show to see alters outside of himself. He sees Yitzhak outside of himself. He sees Ariana outside of himself. He sees Johnny and Mike as these two friends at high school who are constantly with him and interacting with him and doing things around him that no one else seems to call him out for. And that's not really how it presents. Alters within a system can be seen as outside people, be that because they're introjects or because the system thinks that they're possessed by a spirit. A lot of systems when they were children had imaginary best friends who turned out to be alters. Like, it's not like it's entirely not true, but it's not experienced in the way that the show seems to portray it. It's not like we're seeing someone external to us. Systems can have hallucinations, systems can have comorbid disorders that cause psychosis and cause hallucinations. I digress. Most of the time, even when an alter feels just as real as an external alter, it is this presence, it's this sense of them being there. Even when we're dissociated and we're seeing the body from third person, or we might be seeing the body as distorted or too big or too small, it's not like we're seeing the other alters physically outside of our body, and not as consistently and not as realistic as the way that it's portrayed in the show. And that's used as a plot twist because Danny constantly believes that Adam is his brother, Adam is his brother, Adam is his brother. And so when he's in court, he's like, no, I was never abused as a child. Like, I didn't go through those things. My brother Adam, stuff happened to Adam, stuff happened to Adam, stuff happened to Adam. And then the plot twist is that Adam is an alter in the system, which is right at the end of the show. So it's DID and alters within the system are used as plot twists multiple times over. There should be a note taken that believing what happened to you happened to somebody else is a part of DID. It's a part of that dissociation. It's a part of that removal from those traumatic experiences. Helena within our system believed herself to be one of our primary abusers. She believed herself to be the individual causing harm to us. So therefore it didn't happen to her, it happened to somebody else. With therapy, with healing, with acceptance, she's come to realize that those events actually happened to her. She was the victim in those events. And it was very, very hard for her to come to terms with because there was always this sense of it didn't happen to me. Like, I did these things, not these things happened to me. And so that is an experience that can happen in DID systems. I'm not saying that it's not, but we're just really tired of DID being used as this plot twist and alters being used as this plot twist. And instead of having media about DID that is following the system in a way that feels authentic to being a system, it feels like these pieces of media are made for singlets to go, oh my God, that must be so scary to deal with. That must be so strange to deal with. Like, it's not made for systems. And I get it. Most of the population isn't systems. But like, it's really hard when all of the media about DID is just further adding to specific stigmas or misrepresenting the disorder in specific ways or presenting it in a way because it's a visual medium. Like, you can't really use a visual medium to describe the feeling of somebody else living in your own skin. Like, that's something that needs words to explain. And you could have a character directly say it, but it's hard to visually depict. And so I get it. I get that presenting alters as outside of the body or seeing them in mirrors like what happens in Moon Knight. It's a way to visually cue in the audience. But then it creates this misconception that that's how DID is experienced, and not the reality of which is that those are just visual mediums to try and explain a mostly internal experience. The second thing we liked, and all of these points are tied together, but the second thing which we liked is how switching is portrayed in the show. Although we didn't like the alters being depicted as physical beings outside of the body, because that creative decision was taken, it did mean that switching was portrayed in a way that we really, really liked. And that was having alters physically step in front of each other to show who is in control. Although when this is happening earlier in the show, it's not really understood that these are alters, it's not really understood that switching is what's occurring, but then when you watch it back, or when you think back on it, you realize that was occurring. And specifically because there's also scenes where Danny brings the memories back up again and then re-experiences them as they actually happen rather than seeing the alters interact. I really liked the scene where Danny and his girlfriend are making out and then Ariana walks into the room, physically steps in front of Danny and like takes over. And that's very, very realistic. Heightened situations, especially ones that are linked to trauma and the system has experienced a lot of sexual violence, so even consensual sexual scenes can bring up similar feelings, can cause the system to switch. And it makes sense that Ariana, who holds a lot of sexual trauma and basically is their sexual protector, would step forward to do the romantic things, to make out with the girlfriend, or with the system's girlfriend, I should say, because that's what she does, it's what she's comfortable with. Danny can't handle that, so somebody else has to. There are other scenes where Danny is being beaten up by some kids. It's actually the scene, we're going to discuss the scene a bit later, but it's the scene where he gets sex splits, but he physically comes out, he physically moves in front of Danny, and then he physically fights these other boys. And I like the way that it's shown as moving in front of, because it does really kind of feel like that. It's when you're moving into the body, it moves like, or at least for us, it feels like you're moving forward. And then when you're switching out, it's like you're being pulled back, you're being taken away from what's going on. You're going inside, but you're going backwards and away from the face. And So I quite liked that presentation of switching, or sorry, I should say that I quite like that presentation of switching. The third thing that we disliked about the show is how healing and processing is approached. We understand that at the time when the show is set, the understanding of DID is far less established than it is now, that healing and what healing was supposed to look like has a very different interpretation then as it does now, that there was less research into how healing for DID is most effective. So we're not necessarily critiquing that fusion was seeming to be what was pushed. What we are critiquing is that it felt very, very rushed. And I do understand that there was time constraints. They were going to court. They needed Danny to be both stable enough and aware of enough of the system to be able to defend himself, to be aware of what was happening in court. But this meant that the healing and the processing felt very rushed. It's also not very explicit how much time is passing between Danny being arrested and the court case taking place. So it may have been months, but it only felt like a couple of weeks, at least to us watching it. So it meant that Danny was very, very quickly forced into accepting that he had DID, which is not always safe and does result in the system shutting down, and it results in this refusal to acknowledge the DID, and that is a pretty accurate representation, and I liked that was showing, but the way that the system was constantly pushed, the way that Raya triggered Yitzhak and caused him to become relatively violent with her, to force breakthroughs, to force acceptance, to force understanding, that forcefulness isn't really helpful. DID is very complex. When treating it, you need to be gentle, you need to be calm, you need to be patient, you need to be slow. And I get that there were extenuating circumstances, but because there's so little representation of DID and even less representation of DID of the system being in treatment, and significant parts of that treatment being shown, I still think that it's worthwhile noting that the way that healing was approached, the way that processing was approached in the show wasn't very safe, and would not be up to today's standards. The other thing was this very big push that Danny was the real one. The other ones were constructions of his mind, that he needed to accept that this has all happened to him, that he was the only real one. And again, our understanding of DID has evolved. There is no real one when it comes to DID. We are all as real as each other. We might have more or less complexity or elaboration. We might have more or less impact externally. We might have more or less impact internally. But DID doesn't form from one splitting. It forms from a never coming together, and then a continuation of new alters forming whenever the system needs that to occur. So we didn't really like that it was pushed that Danny was the main alter, but it makes sense time-wise. It's just so little representation about DID that it feeds into this misconceptions. Even if it's time accurate, it just gets complicated. It just gets really, really complicated. The third thing that we liked was the fact that the system was showing to change and evolve. New alters split when they were needed, alters went dormant when they were no longer needed, and some alters fronted more or less in specific situations as was needed. Very, very realistic. There is one scene that shows Yitzhak's actual splitting, and it's when the system is being attacked by a bunch of kids from school. They're all teenagers, and Danny is being beaten up, and Yitzhak comes out of a house, an abandoned house, and he physically fights these kids. And realistically, this was the system defending themselves. And there is a small critique of, yes, a system can split that instantaneously, but often splitting comes with repercussions like headaches, etc. But because it was being presented that Yitzhak was his own person, none of those other side effects were shown. But I did like that it was showing that alters could split in your teen years. There was no adults that split in adult years, at least to my awareness, but there was new alters discovered in adult years, and connections built in adult years. And there were also a lot of alters who went dormant. Within the show, they were referred to as the undesirables. They were alters who had fulfilled their role and were no longer needed. And so Jack had, he kind of killed them, honestly. He also shoots Yitzhak and kills him at one point to force him to go dormant, which if you want to hear about dead alters and forced dormancy and alters dying and all that, we have a video about it. Hey everybody, it's Flower from the future. You can tell it's the future. My hair's a different colour. So Minerva ended up switching out and Cryptic switched in while she was answering this question, and Cryptic just moved on to the next question and didn't actually finish our thoughts about this point, so I'm going to finish those thoughts. So the system changes and adapts to different situations, and as alters are no longer needed, they're put into dormancy. How the alters in the system are put into dormancy is by Jack disposing of them, and when he disposes Yitzhak within the show, he shoots him. It should be said that just because a system is violent in the inner world, it does not mean they are violent externally. We talk later in this video about why it's really relatable that the system is violent internally, and I just want to state very, very clearly that just because violence takes place in the inner world does not mean a system will externally act on this violence. The crowded room has the system act on that violence externally as well, and that is not a great representation. People with DID are more often the victims of violent crimes, even in their adult years, even once they've already developed the disorder, but are more likely to be the victims of violent crimes than to perpetrate those violent crimes. But we did like how the system changed and evolved, and we liked that alters not only went dormant, but also could come out of dormancy. At the end of the show, Adam comes out of dormancy. Danny interacts with him in the inner world. They physically interact with each other, and Adam comes out of dormancy. We don't really know where that leads to because that's not really explored in the show, but it's showing that altered death is not permanent. It is not a permanent state of being. You can come back from that. But overall, the point being, we liked that the show depicted a dynamic system, a system whose makeup changed with what was needed. They split, they went dormant, and alters would front more or less frequently in specific situations. And that was very well depicted. That was very, very relatable. That is a very, very common experience for systems, and we liked how that was done. It's cryptic. I'm going to move on to 4. I know that we're talking about 3. I'm not sure if we finished our point about 3, so I'm sorry if that got cut short a little bit. But the 4th thing that we disliked is Raya breaks and enters and violates the law. She does get called out for it. This is just a small critique. We did have to kind of reach for some of these critiques because we did enjoy the show overall. But therapists are never really well portrayed in media. Like they always do something that breaks the rules, the law, whatever. Like in Split, again, the therapist goes to their actual, like the system's actual property, which we will be reviewing Split. We'll go in a whole rant about that in itself. But Raya breaks and enters into the place where Danny lives, and she steals the art book that the system has, and she does get called out for it. She gets called out for it with the cop that she's working, or the detective that she's working alongside. So it's not something that's just like acknowledged as being okay, but I just really like for there to be some therapist representation where they don't do something illegal. The 4th thing that we liked about the show is that their inner world is reflective of trauma. Now, not all systems' inner worlds are going to reflect their trauma, but a lot of systems have inner worlds that reflect real life experiences that they've had. So that can either be safe places or it can be very dangerous places. So for this system, their inner world is the barn where their stepfather Marlon sexually assaulted them throughout their childhood. And it's a complex inner world to a degree. Like it is still just kind of the barn. There's also an outside of it. But there are levels to the barn. There are alters who are dormant there. I like that alters can get locked away in the inner world. It's not great for alters to be locked away in the inner world, but it happens for so many different systems and for so many different reasons. We liked that alters, when they were fronting, couldn't necessarily hear what was going on in the inner world, but that when you looked at the inner world, the alters who could... We also liked that in the inner world you could see alters who were co-conscious, and there was sometimes communication back and forth between different alters fronting internally. It was just, I liked how the inner world was represented. I quite liked it within the show, and I liked that it was complex and detailed. And while our own inner world is not very... It's not very realistic, it's theoretical, we've mentioned this before, it was still cool to see an inner world that a lot of systems do experience, even if it's not our own experience. Our 5th and final critique of the show is that DID was presented as the alter disorder. It was very clearly explicit that it came from childhood trauma. It was very clearly explicit that there was amnesia presented, but pretty much at any given time, it was known which alter was fronting. And why might that be a critique, you might ask? Because for us, for a lot of systems that we know, there are long periods of time where the system doesn't know who they are, where there's intense depersonalization, where there are multiple alters blended into front at once and you can't tease each other apart, where it gets really, really complex and tricky to know who you are as individuals. Like, even right now, even though I know I'm cryptic, there are other people close to front that are kind of souping together, blending together, and able to tell each other apart, even blending into me a little bit and making it hard for me to feel 100% like myself because their influence is so strong. And none of that was touched on. None of that really gets touched on in DID media. It is so focused on the obvious, the overt symptoms, the very clearly defined different alters that like it's just entirely missed the small things that like get to you every single day, the chronic dissociation that you experience every single day. And that's the other critique. Again, this is another piece of system representation where there are very overt alters, and there are systems with overt alters, but that is the minority of presentations. Even the differences that we have that you see in our videos is because we are actively unmasking, we are actively comfortable, and even then there are a lot of similarities between us. We don't go and change our clothes. We might do our hair differently, but we don't really bother unless we know we're going to be out for a while. We'll use similar fidgets, we have similar turns of phrases, we have similar vocal ranges, especially alters that are the same gender as each other. Like there are a lot of similarities between us, whereas most of the alters when they were depicted as fronting were very starkly different. Like they had very stark and distinct accents, they had very stark and distinct ways of presentation, ways of body movement, and it's frustrating. Because I don't want to say that that's not how DID presents, because it is how it presents for some, but it's not the majority of experiences. And we'd really love a piece of media that gets popular that shows more than it just being alters and amnesia, because whilst that's the diagnostic criteria, the actual lived experience is a lot more complex than that. And that's why I think that channels where people talk about their own experiences with DID, be that videos or blogs or all of that kind of stuff, is really, really important to actually increasing an understanding about what living with DID is actually like. Okay, and the fifth thing that we liked about the show was the complex relationships that the system had with itself and that the system had externally. There is a relationship between Ariana and a character who we forgot to name called Jerome. Jerome is Ariana's partner. They meet up at I think it's explicitly called a gay club, but Ariana is presenting as a trans woman, and she has a boyfriend, basically. And I really like Jerome's character. Jerome's character is probably our favorite in the entire show. He is very understanding of the system. He is very accepting. He's very much like, no, Danny, you're not like Ariana. Like, there's definitely differences here. I quite like him, and I like that he has his own unique relationship to Danny than he does Ariana. He's Danny's friend, but he's Ariana's partner, and that partnership does break up. It's not sustainable, especially considering that the system is going into like a psychiatric facility after committing crimes. But I like that relationship, and I like that it shows the different alters can have different relationships. I also really enjoy the different relationships that the system has with their therapist. I like that Jack is very blunt with her, very reserved, does not want to share things. He's aware of the system before Danny is, and he's like, don't tell Danny. That's very, very realistic to what it is like for a lot of systems, especially when you have gatekeepers and protectors who are reluctant for the host or for specific alters to know about the system, to know about trauma, to know about what happened. Jack doesn't want other people to know that they have DID, even though he's a very overt alter. He has a British accent when the system's American. But I like that his relationship with Raya is very different to his relationship with Danny's. There's a scene that we forgot to mention earlier when we're switching, where Jack switches to Danny. It's shown externally rather than like the internal view. And Tom Holland's acting in this is very, very great. It's a very, very subtle scene where you can just see his facial features shift very, very slightly from being Jack to being Danny. And you can see the different ways that the system perceives Raya, just in the way that Tom Holland's face shifts when Jack is watching Raya versus to when Danny is watching Raya. There's also very complex internal relationships. Johnny and Mike kind of get along, but they also argue. Jack is very controlling. Yitzhak thinks that he's protecting the system, and Jack thinks that he's protecting the system, and they don't get along at certain points. They argue. Jack literally shoots Yitzhak in the head, which... like, there can be violence enacted in the inner world, and alters can hate each other and disagree and try to harm each other. And I like that is represented. It's a really hard thing to deal with. It's really, really difficult to navigate. It really, it's not something that we enjoy in practice, but we enjoy seeing the representation of that. So with the 5 things that we like and the 5 things that we dislike about the show out of the way, let's discuss our 3 key points that we're using for every piece of DID media that we're reviewing. Overall, The system did meet criteria for DID. There was explicit amnesia shown, there was distinct alternate identities, it was caused by significant childhood trauma, and it was established within the show that that is what defines dissociative identity disorder. There was one part where they were like, DID is only formed from childhood sexual abuse, but the therapist didn't correct that and just said it was childhood abuse, which is true. It doesn't have to be sexual abuse, but for a lot of systems it is. And it was very, very good at making sure that the system actually met criteria. Was the show stigmatizing? Yeah, kind of. It's not as bad as it could have been, but it also wasn't great. Like, being tied to the many faces of Billy Milligan means that automatically you're linking it to serial killers, which is not good. DID systems are not serial killers. It wasn't as stigmatizing as we thought it would be. We thought it would be a lot worse than it was, but it still did feed into certain stigmas. It also fed into the misconceptions that alters are very differentiated from each other. It fed into misconceptions that systems consistently see alters outside of themselves. And to end it all off with, did we enjoy the show? Yes. The show is an absolute banger. We did enjoy it. We would recommend it. There are some significant trigger warnings going into it. Obviously, it discusses childhood abuse, childhood sexual abuse. There's also some adult sexual abuse that occurs. There is some graphic self-harm scenes that we just entirely skipped over. Like, it is a relatively triggering show. There is a lot of potentially even a trigger warning for denial thoughts, because there are people in the show saying DID isn't even real, but it is real, and they argue that within the show and obviously win on that because he gets sent to a psychiatric facility. Thank you all for watching. We will be reviewing another piece of DID media soon. We might put up a poll to see which one we review next. It was a great pleasure to make this video for you. It was a great pleasure to actually watch the show that we've been putting off for ages. This gave us a good reason to watch it. Let us know your thoughts on The Crowded Room if you've seen it, or if you haven't, are you going to watch it now? We will see you in the next video. Goodbye.